Hello, welcome to Nonprofit Program Planning and Evaluation. My name is Charles McElveen, and this is Lesson 7, Program Evaluation, Evaluation Types and Stakeholder Needs. There are several outcomes to this lesson. The first is you will be able to explain the benefits of an intentional and integrated program evaluation plan. Secondly, you'll be able to match the appropriate evaluation type to its intended use. Thirdly, you'll be able to determine the evaluation focus area by selecting those components from the theory of change and or your logic model that are the most relevant. Remember, not everything that is orchestrated needs to be measured. Next, collaborate with stakeholders to identify what they hope to learn from the evaluation. And then lastly, establish the ways and extent to which you plan to make use of the evaluation information. Now, this last point is one that's often lost, that is, once you conduct the evaluation, what do you do with it? How do you make it actionable? And this is where this outcome targets specifically. So let's begin. When it comes to evaluation types, there's really two grand types that you need to determine. First, are you going to do a formative evaluation, which is all about improving your program? Or are you going to do a summative evaluation, which is about proving something about the program? The formative evaluation is always done in process. This happens during the program is going on. It's as it is happening. Summative evaluation is after the program is over for that individual or individuals. Now, if you took the education course, you were acquainted with this before. Formative evaluation is how do I assess student learning as it is occurring, and then the summative evaluation is how do I know that they learned what I said I was going to teach them. So a formative evaluation in that setting is maybe a question and an answer session as you're teaching the class, and a summative evaluation is them taking the test when it's over. So the formative evaluation, it's based on process metrics, and that's what program leadership is going to use to monitor progress and to make any mid-course corrections in the program. With a summative evaluation, the results of a program are going to the stakeholders, and the stakeholders are going to use that to determine the value and the worth of the program based upon the results. Now, this one, think of this as ROI, return on investment. And newer strategies of donor development focuses on this one right here. This is one you're going to have to get to learn really well, and that is, how can I prove or demonstrate to the stakeholders that there is value and result in this program? Over here, in formative, the focus is on your activities, your outputs, and your short-term outcomes. If you remember, short-term outcomes are attitudes, skills, and knowledge. The focus in summative really comes down to your intermediate and long-term, which are behaviors and conditions. And oftentimes, behaviors may not be something that you can get at right away, and especially with the case of long-term outcomes, unless you have some sort of aftercare program where you can track people as they graduate. The benefit of a formative evaluation is it's helpful in bringing suggestions for improvement to the attention of staff. So as you're noting different trends in the data as you're going through the process here, you'll be able to see ways that you can tweak or modify the program as you're going. And the benefit over here in the summative evaluation, it's helpful in describing quality and effectiveness by documenting its impact and participants and the community. So if you remember in the previous lesson we talked about especially the continuum of care. There's two levels in continuum of care. One of them is focused squarely on the individual and the individual's long-term outcome. Taken collectively, that moves to a higher level, which is the HUD-sponsored continuum of care, where you have nonprofit organizations in a geographic area grouping together in teamwork to reduce homelessness in that area. And that's where we start talking about impact on community. So the summative evaluation is really going to be at the most, I guess, at its most home, if that's a great way to say that, when you're dealing with the HUD-sponsored continuum of care, and also when you're talking about the long-term outcomes of your participants. Now, there are different ways you can use an evaluation, or 4 big areas of evaluation uses. Now, I alluded to those and just brushed the surface of those in the prior slide with formative and summative evaluation. Here's the way you can focus those. And the first way you can focus it is when you're looking at impact. And one of those, continuum of care, HUD-sponsored, high level, is you're providing information to determine the degree to which the program meets its goal. Now, this is very high level. So if your goal is to reduce homelessness in a specific area, or you're reducing barriers for people that lead to long-term stable housing, this is where you're going to use the impact. Because the question is going to be, well, at the end of 5 years, how many people that have gone through the program are actually living in stable housing? And so that's going right to a long-term outcome, all about impact. It's useful in providing evidence for policy and funding, especially when you're talking with donors. This is where the real return on investment comes in, or return on social investment. So it's no longer will you be able to make the case that because you provide a service, you're worthy of donor dollars or donor support. Now donor development officers are being challenged to demonstrate that your program participants are better off years down the road because of their involvement in your program. So that ROI is significant, and that is an area of which that you really need to be in teamwork with your donor development folks. Another way you can focus your formative and summative evaluations is on process. So process specifically focuses on how your program operates and the documents and procedures and activities and service delivery. So it's all about how well do you do the process itself. How many people can you work through the process of intake and then placing them in specific programs, tracking their progress as they move from phase to phase. So that's all about the process. And it's very useful in identifying problems that you can see here faced in delivering your services, as well as the strategies or tactics you use for overcoming the problem. So if you have a challenge with intake and tracking your intake, perhaps you're losing people in that process, you'll make a change, then you'll come back and see if the change helped or not. And so that's directly going to your process. Maybe on a scale of 1 to 5, how was this intake for you personally as a participant? And you ask that enough times and you find out that people are having a bad time with it. It's a 2 on a scale of 5. Well, that's a process issue, and you'll have to go back and fix that. The last one here, it's useful when replicating or adapting program strategies. This is a big one because you can't usually take one program from one area and drop it into another area and expect it to work. And what I mean by that is you can't expect that you would be able to take, for instance, a program from St. Matthew's House and drop it lock, stock, and barrel into Union Rescue Mission LA. The contexts are different. How they approach ministry is probably going to be somewhat different. And so you'll have to take that into account when you start looking at processes, because their processes are probably going to be very different. Now, you can certainly attempt to do that, and then you can benchmark it. You can look at how that process is working and then make changes accordingly. Another way that you can focus your evaluation is on performance. And that's providing information on the extent to which your organization's program's outcomes are being met. So in the prior slide here, we talked about the impact, degree to which the program meets its goal. That's at a much higher level than the information on your program outcomes being met. So when we talk about program outcomes, we're talking about your short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. And a lot of times what you're going to do there is you're going to resort to percentages. It usually occurs in tandem with the process evaluation, and that makes sense because your process is going to impact your performance. If you have a really poor process, you're probably going to have poor performance as well. And the measures arise from previously identified input and outcome indicators. Now, we've talked about outcome indicators. The input indicators I briefly mentioned in prior lessons, but your input indicators are being able to say how many of something I need to carry out this activity. And that may change depending on the number of activities or the number of people that participate in those activities. And lastly, it's useful in assessing your program performance and accomplishments. Another type is going to be the cost evaluation. This is where your CFO and your development officers are really going to be involved and interested, and your CEO as well to a large extent. But the focus here is when you're doing a cost evaluation, you're identifying and measuring the resources themselves used in a program in relation to alternative uses. So you're comparing, gee, how much would it cost if I outsourced this thing versus if I did this in-house? Pardon me. And then the benefits being produced by the program. And that can oftentimes be intangible. So it comes down to, for instance, it may cost you more to do this program. However, and it could be that it's more expensive than the exact same program you could outsource, that you could refer people to. However, that outsource may not be values aligned. So in this case, it may make sense to go ahead and build in-house, staff in-house, resource in-house, even though it costs more money because it's more values aligned with the organization than if you had outsourced. And this is when it's useful to defend your cost against alternative uses. And so you can't resort to, well, this program costs more than what I could get outside the organization. Therefore, we're not going to do it. We're going to outsource. I'm willing to guess that your donors, once they understand that the reason your program costs more is because it's values aligned, they're going to be more receptive to that program costing more. So those are the 4 different ways you can focus your evaluation. And bear in mind, you can do these independently, just with the caution that performance and process usually go together. All right, let's move on to some different types of research that you can conduct. Now, the outcome of these research strategies are eventually going to be documented studies that you can provide, or ammunition, so to speak, for why you do this thing or another thing. The first thing about qualitative research, it is a subjective activity, meaning it doesn't rest on hard and fast numerics. Observations that cannot be described meaningfully numerically. It attempts to answer the question of how people negotiate the complexities of everyday life or to gain insight. It entails interviews and focus groups or observations, and it's used in understanding people's responses and meanings that they bring to the experiences. And lastly, observations, surveys, case studies, all these are used to gather the data. So what am I getting at here with all these bullet points? The highest points I can make, number 1, it's not numeric. Number 2, it's subjective. You're unpacking people's thoughts, feelings, emotions, and maybe even to some extent, you're able to record your observations of these individuals to make a case for something. So maybe you're making the case that you need more hands-on interaction with case managers, or maybe you're making the case that your clients, your participants, aren't having as good an outcome in your program as you were hoping they would. And the way you get to that is by observing people and how they interact with you. Maybe it's by surveys that you can take. Now, this is usually going to be more of a quantitative, but these case studies, you're studying different people's lives, they're through biographies, interviews that you conduct with them, and questionnaires, even back to the focus groups. The point is that it's not all about numbers. So, for instance, there was one organization where I interviewed like 10 clients, and out of those 10 clients, I was able to get to what was important to them and what their feelings were about the programs, their challenges, their victories. And I was able to put those into themes and be able to demonstrate to the organization that I was working for that their program was beneficial because of the number of times, and this is where quantitative can pop up, that I identified this theme in my surveys or in my interviews, in my questionnaires. All right, so qualitative, not necessarily about numbers. Now, here's some examples of qualitative research, and what these are questions. And these questions, for instance, you could go out and you could go to each level of stakeholder and ask that stakeholder, what is important for you to be able about this program? What do you need to know about this program that's important? It'll help you make a decision whether you want to participate or not. Another question may be, how do you know that this program is achieving what it purports to achieve? So by having those questions, you can go to each one of those stakeholder groups, and out of that, you can begin to group those questions. And that'll be the springboard for your qualitative research. Now, what I've done here is, under resources, I went out and I interviewed 9 groups of stakeholders for one organization. And out of those 9 different groups of stakeholders, I was able to identify common themes. And on one level, I grouped those common themes by each stakeholders group. And then I came in and said, okay, well, let's drop that into the logic model. And let's try and identify the big questions in each area of the logic model that stakeholders may want to ask or they would like to know about. So on one level, under resource, who does each program serve? And the reason that's here is because without a program participant, that's a resource, your program doesn't run. Who are you going to collaborate with? Have we reached out to them? Should we reach out to them? And this was more of a board level type of thing. Faith-based programs. Do I have to be a Christian to be in your program? That's squarely a question that came from a participant. Then up in the activities section, after grouping all the questions from these individuals, how are your programs offered? Here's another one. Do our results inform us regarding the focus or tactics? And that's a formative type of question, but that's specifically for program operators. And then what does success look like for me? That's going to definitely be a program participant. Whereas maybe up here, board level, what programs does the organization operate? I did that for each section of the logic model. So then with qualitative research, as you go out and you start conducting interviews of all these different stakeholder groups with these questions, and out of that you're able to develop good answers, so to speak, that answer all these questions. All right, let's look at quantitative. Let's go back to qualitative. So once you're done with the qualitative, if you ask enough people some of these questions, you're going to have a very firm grouping of answers, and that's an example of qualitative. You can say, I went out and I interviewed 87 people amongst these stakeholders, and here are the answers that I got back. So it's not a hard and fast survey that you can resort to. But how can you apply that? You can apply it through the quantitative research concerned with precise measure, formal, objective, and systematic. And the numerical data are used to obtain information about the subject under study. So, for instance, you go out and you do a qualitative research and you document 97 interviews, and out of that you identify half a dozen key themes. Then you can put that into a survey form and send that out to a lot larger audience and ask them the degree to which they agree with the statements that came out of this qualitative study. So one thing leads to another. So it's deductive and outcomes oriented. So you're really here quantitative because, especially with quantitative, you're really dealing with something that's more summative in nature. So you're finding about after action, and it's deductive. You're trying to make connections between what the data is telling you and the outcome itself. And the most common types of this in a program setting are going to be random sampling. So you may go to throw a survey out. Let's say you've got 78 people in transitional housing. A random sample is you throw all their, put their names into a hat, all of them, and have someone reach into the hat and grab out 6 people or 8 people. And there actually is a formula that tells you what's a valid random sample. So if you pull one name out of 78 that are in the hat, that's not going to tell you anything. But each time you draw a number or a name out of the hat, it's going to solidify the validity of that random sample or the reliability of it. And there comes a tipping point when it becomes too much. Regression analysis is pretty helpful when you're trying to look at 2 variables. So for instance, you see that people are failing in an outcome or in a class, and not only do you want to know how many people are failing, but to what degree does that maybe have to do with the instructor. So regression is you're trying to look at 2 different elements at the same time. Correlation is about looking at, for instance, the number of people to time of year. And while it may not be exact and causative, meaning that spring means that you will have X amount of more people, and that's hard and fast. Correlation, you would say it more like, well, it seems like in the spring we have more people, or in the spring it seems like our numbers spike or they drop. That's correlation. It's not a cause and effect. And then standardized testing is something you would definitely see more in the formative stage, depending on where they are in the program. But it could also be summative. At the end of a educational program, you could do a standardized test, and that would certainly tell you if someone is passing or not. And that becomes, the same test goes to everybody, so it's standard. Here's a quantitative research example, and this is a quantitative that I did for an organization, and we have these 4 different outcomes. And the outcomes all had to do with about skills. One outcome was about reconciliation. One was about barrier resolution, and one was about transformational relationships. And then here, where we've got DP0, these are times. So this happened at intake, and then 90 days later, 180 days after this one, or 90 after this one. And then during program 3, that happened 90 days after during program 2. So we're out 270 days here from here. And you can see when you look at the quantitative numbers that they're doing a pretty good job at barriers, but something happens in the reconciliation process and in the skill right here, it drops off. And so that gives you a point where you can start asking yourself, why is this happening? Why do we see this drop off? And this becomes more robust when you do it more often, or I should say not more often necessarily, but when you're tracking it systematically and intentionally over time. And this gives you an example of what that looks like quarter by quarter. And there's little variation from quarter to quarter with these numbers. So they're pretty good. It tells me that their process is pretty tight because they don't have huge variations in quarter to quarter for each one of these areas. But still, you've got this drop up here in skills and reconciliation, so that may be something helpful to look at as people hit this phase of their program. Something happens here in the skills. So that's just a plain line diagram. And then here we've got a bar chart, and this is a stacked bar. So you can see out of 100% here, but you start off with 100%. Out of that 100%, you can see 6-year outcomes up in here, total number of people. So, and this breaks it down by race. So again, starting off with 100%, let's look at Asians compared to blacks, to Hispanics and whites. A real quick snapshot by seeing outcome achievement by race. You got 51% here have completed by Asians, and then only 28% with black. So right away you're able to say, well, what's happening here between this 28 and this 51? What's happening between Asians and blacks? Is there something cultural that we're not seeing? So that's another way to get a real quick snapshot view when you're comparing evaluation data. Okay, that's lesson 7. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in lesson 8.